With the strategic rivalry between the United States and China heating up across vital areas of global politics and economy, it seems the two powers are set to go head-to-head across the continent of Africa. Earlier this month, leaders of the Group of Seven countries agreed to launch the Build Back Better World, or B3W initiative, championed by the Biden administration. And the B3W plan directly rivals China's Belt and Road Initiative for the infrastructural development of low and middle income countries. Now, Washington has long called the Chinese financing model a debt trap and accused it of neocolonialism. The question is, though, can the B3W materialise as a genuine alternative in the long run, providing sustainable financing for development to improve connectivity, transport, logistics, trade and the creation of jobs? To answer this question, there's no one better to turn to than our guest today. Having served as the librarian president's deputy chief of staff and also the Minister of Public Works, Uday Moore has been at the forefront of making and initiating deals on massive infrastructure programs. He is now based in Washington, D.C. as a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Moore. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
And well, first of all, with this pandemic situation that's been going on for more than a year, how has the COVID-19 virus really affected infrastructural challenges in countries across Africa, as well as their ability to really finance public works projects?
Thank you. I think the impact has been twofold. One is just logistical, right? Because when the global economy shut down because of movement restrictions, it meant that people physically couldn't go to work, and so that's part of it. But it also meant that there were backlogs in logistics chains of things that needed to be able to do construction. But more importantly, it is the lack of financing. Up to 40% of infrastructure financed in Africa is paid for directly out of national budgets by African governments. And because of this crisis is sort of twofold. There's the health crisis, and then there's the economic crisis. And the economic crisis has meant that there's a liquidity crunch, and most African governments are struggling to be able to pay their bills. And so because of that, there's not as much money available to finance infrastructure. Most importantly, countries now have to choose between whether buying PPEs or buying medical equipment and responding to the health crisis or building infrastructure. There has been a decline in financing from China, and that's been happening since like 2014. There's been a decline in financing from multilateral institutions and from the private sector. So the pandemic has really sort of reduced the available money to finance infrastructure in Africa.
And well, recently the attention has really turned to infrastructure development in Africa as the strategic rivalry heats up between Washington and Beijing. And well, US officials, they've been calling the Belt and Road Initiative a form of debt trap on the part of the Chinese. And US President Biden, of course, has now championed his own initiative, the B3W plan, as an alternative that upholds democratic values over autocratic ones. But would you say, in terms of, practically speaking, do governments in Africa share the same concerns right now about more of these idealistic values, I suppose, and also debt levels? And would they be as inclined to work with the West simply based on this kind of ideological stance?
Yeah, I really doubt that the motivation and the driver of decisions by African governments in seeking financing is driven by anything ideological. I think most of it is based in pragmatism. Countries go where the resources are. Countries go where they go to partners who have the competencies and who have the funding to be able to finance their infrastructure. So I don't think it's driven by any ideology. It's also important to point out that of all of the regions of the world, Africa lags in the coverage of infrastructure, whether it's for paved roads or it's for electricity. And so as much infrastructure that the continent can get, it will seek, and whoever can provide that, it will work with them. On the question of debt, I think there is a concern with African governments and with African publics about debt, because the last thing you want is for a country to become so indebted building infrastructure that it is not able to finance things like health, things like education. So the debt issue is a definite problem there. But how, and this is what raises questions about B3W. Since B3W is not going to give grants to African governments, it's definitely going to be some form of debt. how does it work and how would it be different from what the Chinese offer? So I think for now, B3W, we have no real details of what it looks like, how it's going to be executed, or the size of what B3W will be. So until we can get those details of what that plan is, it's sort of difficult to actually be able to rate it or rank it in terms of what African countries actually need.
So while we're very short on details right now, what kinds of merits do you think the B3W will have to offer in order to actually become quite be able to strongly compete with the Chinese financing model? And or would you say that America and its allies, their B3W plan is a bit too late to the game now anyway?
Well, so the infrastructure need is massive. Across low and middle income countries, the need is $40 trillion. So as much money as we can get into financing infrastructure, that's necessary. And I can't say it's late. We wish it had come earlier, but it's better late than never in this case. I think there is an advantage for B3W. The abiding critique of Chinese lending has been that it's always been the terms have been shrouded in secrecy, that China intentionally in negotiating includes terms that says that the terms of the agreement can be kept secret. Today in Kenya, there is a case where activists are suing the Kenyan government to provide the details of the deal that the loan agreement that financed the rail from Mombasa to Nairobi. So I think if B3W is able to offer similar loans, but do it under more open terms and clearer terms, I think that is a clear advantage. In terms of B3W being an alternative to BRI, I did not see in terms of what was announced that B3W is going to be financing transport infrastructure, rail, roads, bridges. And that is a place where the Chinese have been dominant. I mean, over the last 20 years, they've done over 6,000 kilometers of rail, over 6 to 10,000 kilometers of road. And the need is still pretty massive in Africa. So if B3W is not financing transport, then it is not a like-for-like replacement for the BRI. More than likely, they will be complementary. And I don't think the one is going to replace the other.
Well, you've mentioned in the past that Chinese presence in Africa, it wasn't, the Chinese didn't go there initially for political purposes, but it was more out of the need, the necessity to do so, as they were the factory of the world and they needed the sort of resources and the expansion there. But it seems that the recent attention on infrastructural development by the G7, it is a bit more politically motivated, as they are using it to directly challenge the Chinese government. But what kind of risk do you see in this infrastructural development race turning into a sort of a new frontier of rivalry between China and the United States? How do you see this competition playing out across the continent?
This is a really good question because, as I noted, the infrastructure need in Africa has been there, and it's always been evident that that infrastructure need was there. And Africa has had a strong relationship with the West for much longer than it has had with the Chinese. And until the Chinese came and began to finance infrastructure at the rate and scale that they've done, there has not been that kind of response from the West in terms of financing Africa's infrastructure. So the risk, though, is that if B3W is only about countering the rise of China and slowing China's growth and influence, what happens when the Chinese scale back or retrench from funding infrastructure? Does that mean B3W would end? And so if it is not driven by the desirability, if it is not driven by the fact that countries need infrastructure to grow their economy, if it is only driven by political purposes, then it creates an inherent risk of what happens when that political purpose is withdrawn. So I have said before that in the West, when they speak of the Cold War, they think of it as a war where there was no real fighting. But across Africa, there were proxy wars. And so many countries in Africa, and for Africans themselves, the last thing they want to do is to be caught in a proxy war simply because the U.S. and China are diverging. So my hope is that B3W becomes an alternative, that it finances some of the things that the U.S. can do really well, like health, like education, like ICT. And then the Chinese are free to do what they do really well, which is transport, ports, and large-scale civil works project. I think that is the best route for African governments.
Mr. What do you think should be done to ensure that African governments don't grow dependent on a single power and that their decisions on whatever partnerships or deals that they make is not compromised by the short-term geopolitical acts of rivalry?
Yeah, so I would just say this quickly, that most times when people think about China and in Africa, they just think about it in terms of the transactional nature. But I think there's something else there. Over the last 30, 40 years, China has done something that no country has ever done before. They have lifted close to 800 million people out of extreme poverty. So if you're a poor African country, there's something aspirational about what the Chinese have done, something really attractive about what the Chinese have done. But because there's this divergence because of values, well, we're seeing what is happening between China and Australia. We're seeing what is happening between China and the EU. We're seeing what happened recently in Hungary between China and the Hungarians. So there's a departure, and we're seeing two camps emerge, one led by the US and one by the Chinese. The fear is that for most African countries, they might get caught in this. I gave an example where Canada circulated a letter at the UN calling out China for human rights violation, alleged human rights violations. And not a single African country signed that. And Belarus circulated a letter supporting the Chinese, and 15 African countries signed up to that. I think the best way for African governments to be able to manage not being drawn into this is through the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, so that they act as a single unit instead of 54 small countries. I think that provides the best possible means of Africa being able to negotiate as equals with China and the United States, be able to increase its leverage and negotiating strength when it does that, because it will be representing all 54 economies in one. I think that's the best possible means. And maybe they can seek other partners that are not China or the United States.
And of course, before they embark on any major infrastructure projects, the COVID-19 pandemic, beating it really should take priority. And after criticism from various organisations around the world, the G7 countries earlier this month, they also agreed to donate 1 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines around the world. But they're being rather slow about it, and they are still bickering about waiving rights to produce the vaccines. What do you think are some practical measures that these governments should take in order to overcome barriers to vaccine procurement and really scale up the rolling out and the production of COVID-19 vaccines around the world?
Well, thank you for raising that question. There are a couple of things about it. I think the first thing they can do is to stop talking about 1 billion doses. The total need globally so that everyone is vaccinated is around 11 billion doses. So why are we talking about 1 billion doses? Because it's not going to do anything. If we need 11 billion doses and you provide 1 billion, that's not helping the problem at all. Secondly, it's not really 1 billion doses. It's somewhere between 615 and 700 million doses, because it includes and adds on to everything that has been done before. So there is a significant moral failure here from the G7. These are the richest countries in the world. And someone might say, well, why can't African countries and Asian countries do this themselves? Listen, and the World Bank, I think the IMF has calculated that there is somewhat, I think, $9 trillion to be gained if we reach herd immunity. Now, $9 trillion in gains is not simply going to accrue to the poorest countries in the world. Some of the rich countries in the world are going to benefit from that significantly. So the idea that poor countries should pay for this doesn't really make sense. So I think some of the most practical things to do is actually fund the problem at the scale where it is. These are countries that have spent trillions of dollars upholding their economies, strengthening their economies. For $50 billion, we will be able to vaccinate most of the world. So the G7, as the richest countries in the world, the countries that have benefited the most from the global system as it is, should pay for the system to be restored. And that's $50 billion. So I think this conversation about $1 billion is just undersells the problem, and it creates an impression that something has been done when what has been proposed is simply too inadequate.
Well, thank you for that wonderful answer, sir. And well, in terms of moving forward in key health and infrastructural projects, do you see then any room for collaborations between countries in Africa and perhaps more politically neutral countries like South Korea?
Yeah, I'm glad. That's why I'm happy to be on South Korean television and talking about this because I think Korea itself, I think African countries can learn from Korea being stuck between great powers. Korea is very integrated with the Chinese economy, but Korea is also one of the U.S. staunchest allies in Asia. And Korea is going to try its best not to be caught into a great power competition. And I think for African countries, you can look to a country like Korea for the kinds of partnership. I gave an example that the most recent infrastructure bridge, a bridge that was built connecting Botswana and Zambia, which is going to enhance trade and logistics across Southern Africa, was built by a Korean company. So Korean companies can be very competitive in the African market. One of the things that has given Chinese firms a competitive edge in the African markets is because they came with money from policy banks in China. So if the Korean Exim Bank is backing Korean construction firms and Korean tech firms, I honestly believe that there is a possibility here opening up for a country like Korea to partner with African countries as they try to avoid being caught in a war, a great power competition between the United States and China.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we'll have to end our interview today as we're out of time, but that was Guy, Senior Policy Fellow at the Centre for Global Development and Liberia's former Minister of Public Works. Thank you again, sir, so much for your time. It was a real honour having you on our show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.